Alrighty, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us again. Today we have a different kind of lecture, a non-technical lecture, but we always think it's really important to frame what we're studying. So we're really lucky today. We have Alan Carr from Los Alamos National Laboratory here to give a history talk. Alan Carr started working as a historian at Los Alamos National Laboratory in 2003 after he finished his master's thesis on Soviet military doctrine. Cool fun fact, he used to share an office with John C. Hopkins, the former head of the Los Alamos Weapons Program, and he was entrusted with weekly responses to public inquiries, similar to this one almost, for information from all over the world. Public speaking has become a favorite part of his job, and we're really lucky to have him here talking to us about the Manhattan Project today. So without further ado, Alan, the floor is yours.
Hey, great. Michael, thank you very much for the invitation. And, before we begin the talk, I just want to say I hope that despite everything that's going on in the world and in the country right now, that all of you are doing well, that you're safe and healthy. And hopefully this will be a little bit of a diversion this afternoon to go back and think about the Manhattan Project in the days of World War II, which were a very challenging time in our history as well. So a few disclaimers before we start this. Now, the Manhattan Project, first of all, was a huge national effort. We will focus a bit more on the Los Alamos perspective eventually, but there are many perspectives to this story. The other thing is that, I am paid by Los Alamos, and so you might think about what I'm leaving out of the story and what I've chosen to put in and things like that that pertain to my own personal biases. I'm going to try and give you a pretty good quick summary of the project, but be sure and ask me questions when we're done that you're interested in. I don't mind the tough questions. Of course, this year is the 75th anniversary of the Trinity test and of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of those topics, because this is a quick talk, I won't spend a whole lot of time on any one of them, but maybe during Q&A we can talk about the things that you're interested in. And again, I do want to reemphasize in a quick history of a big talk like this, there's a lot of things that are going to be left out, and so do be cognizant of that as we go through. And I think we should go ahead and begin. So let's get started with slide number 1. Now, whenever I talk about the Manhattan Project, I think that it's important to examine why the Manhattan Project came into existence in the first place. What was going on in the world at that point in time? And hopefully we'll, Michael, can you, is it delayed on the changing the slides? There we go. Yeah, I know sometimes there's a little bit of lag on here, and Michael's running my slides today, and I'm really grateful that he's helping me out with that. Before we get to the Manhattan Project, we're going to go back a few years and run through a little bit of prehistory really quickly. So World War II was started by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. We're not going to talk about the Cold War today. Unfortunately, we don't have time. But if we do a Cold War talk one of these days about the growth of the nuclear stockpile and things like this, a lot of that story begins here and even decades earlier in our relationship with the Soviet Union. But you might keep this in mind as we go through the talk. So Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. 17 days later, Joseph Stalin invaded Poland as well. The two countries had secretly signed a non-aggression pact, and part of that non-aggression pact secretly carved Poland in two. And so you can see on our map down there, there's, unfortunately, I don't have the countries labeled, but most of you probably know where Poland is there. The Soviets took their half of Poland. They never gave it back to the Poles. They took off pieces of Germany after World War II and kind of welded it onto the other side against, again, hence Cold War tensions. But anyway, that's how the war starts in Europe. And this was quite a shock to many people in the world that Hitler and Stalin, who were perceived as great rivals and enemies, could actually come together and sign this non-aggression pact. Now, Britain and France had guaranteed to protect Poland in the event of an invasion. And so they immediately declared war on Nazi Germany, but they didn't declare war on the Soviet Union. I think that the main reason why is just the logistics involved. Take, for instance, if you're Great Britain, and Great Britain is going to be an important part of our story today. Can you imagine declaring war on both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union at the same time? That's a pretty tall order. So anyway, keep that in mind for later. The British in particular, do not like the Soviet Union, never have, don't trust them, and this is only added fuel to that fire. So anyway, let's talk about what the Soviets do next very quickly. After they take their half of Poland, they invade Finland. Now, this was known as the Winter War, and you can go to our map there again, and you can see the tracts of land that Stalin took from the Finns. Now, this was not a quick and easy campaign. It actually took months and months for the Red Army to force the Finns to give up some of their land. Now, that too was a surprise. I mean, you look at the Soviet Union's an enormous country. It had, I think, about 180 million people within it at the time. Finland had 4 million people. But they were able to fight off the Red Army for months and months. Now, there were many reasons why, but today, I think the main reason we'll focus on is that Stalin decapitated his military. He felt that in 1936, 1937, 38, that if any entity within the Soviet Union could threaten his power, it was the military. And so he got rid of about nearly half of the officers of the Red Army. Many of them were dismissed from service. Tens of thousands of them were imprisoned and, or executed. And so Stalin really did himself a disservice. When the Red Army invaded Finland, it showed the world how weakened the Red Army and the Soviet Union had become because of Joseph Stalin's purges. Now, Hitler and Stalin have signed a non-aggression pact, but do you think that Hitler would be willing to break a pact abruptly if it would help him? Maybe. And so he's looking at the Soviet Union, he's looking at Stalin, and thinks, wow, we've signed a non-aggression pact, but if, considering how they did in Finland, if we attack the Soviet Union, they probably would not last very long. So file that one away as well, because we're going to come back to that. Stalin, after he extracts land from Finland, he next annexes large portions of Romania. You can see them listed there. In some, about a 20%, 25% of Romania. And next, he forcefully annexes Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia as well. And so let's go back to the map one more time. You can see all the land that is in light pink there. Those are all new territorial acquisitions for Joseph Stalin in the early days of World War II. So the Soviet Union was incredibly expansionistic. They worked with Hitler to start this war. And one thing I didn't mention as I started the talk was this talk on the Manhattan Project is not only from the Los Alamos perspective, it's from the American perspective. And there are a lot of others that, I wish that we had more time for, but again, I'm just going to share with you this one for the most part. Let's see another slide. And now we're going to see what the Germans were up to. And the German aggression and expansion is generally more well known, I think, to people. We'll run through it very quickly. And so Germany invades Denmark and Norway in April 1940. As you can see there, the following month, they invade Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, France. And as France is collapsing, Italy jumps in on the side of the Germans in early June. Now, World War II was really a series, if you look at it as a history, it's a series of massive strategic miscalculations. One of these was that France would be able to potentially, if anybody could stop the Germans in continental Europe, it would be France. And unfortunately, France only lasted for 6 weeks before they collapsed. And so who's left to fight the Germans in Western Europe? The Brits. It must have been a pretty lonely place to be in Great Britain at that point in time. Now, remember that one as well, because that's going to come back when we start talking about the scientific aspect of this shortly. But anyway, the Germans try and do something that had never been done before. They want to try and take out Britain using air power alone. This is known as the Battle of Britain. If the Brits don't surrender, they'll at least gain mastery of the air and be able to take out any ships of the Royal Navy that would try and prevent an invasion of England. But anyway, the Battle of Britain commences. And the Germans don't do as well as they hoped. The Brits resist. The other thing is the Brits also have a really nice home field advantage. That is that if you're fighting Germans high over the land and you get shot down, you bail out, you go get another plane, and you go right back into action against Hitler's Air Force, the Luftwaffe. On the other hand, if you're a German pilot, fighter pilot, bomber crew, if you get shot down over England, then you are a prisoner of war and you're done. And so the Germans were losing planes and experienced pilots and air crews. And so this was very costly. And you might be thinking, well, there was nothing else to invade. I mean, why didn't they just finish the job? Well, the Germans, by this point in time, they had larger plans. Hitler had been thinking about the invasion of the Soviet Union. I do think that Hitler all along had really wanted to invade the Soviet Union. And so I know it may come as a shock to some of you, but Hitler breaks the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and invades on June 22nd, 1941. The Battle of Britain kind of ended in a stalemate, depending on who you talk to. That's my take at least. But the Germans kind of abandoned, this is another big strategic miscalculation. They abandoned the Battle of Britain thinking that Britain has been neutralized, they're isolated, they pose no strategic threat to us, and they take all of their forces, concentrate them against the Soviet Union. Now, when that invasion took place on June 22nd, 1941, it was and actually remains by far the largest military invasion in history. You had, if you'll remember on the map on the previous slide, Finland, the Romanians, Hungarians were all allied with the Germans. Many of those countries wanted their land back. And so you had soldiers from Finland all the way to the Black Sea invading the Soviet Union. Roughly 7 million soldiers engaged each other in the opening days of that campaign. I believe that the Soviet Union lost 1,200 military planes the first morning of that campaign. The Germans go into the Soviet Union, they make massive gains, they inflict something like 2 million, I think, fatalities on the Red Army by the fall of 1941. These are just staggering numbers. I mean, there's really no way for us, I can't imagine 2 million soldiers, 1,200 planes. This was incredibly violent. But anyway, the Soviet Union has a few advantages working for them. Germans thought that the Soviet Union would quickly collapse. It turns out that the government of the Soviet Union and its military was more robust than they planned. The Germans encountered better military equipment in some regards than they had previously expected. A big advantage of the Soviet Union is that there's lots of it to fall back into and retreat. And at first, Stalin ordered his soldiers to stand and fight to the death. Well, when you stand and fight to the death against a vastly superior invading force, numerically superior, better equipment, you get surrounded and annihilated. And that's exactly what happened. As the months passed, Stalin allowed his soldiers to retreat. And this was very frustrating to the Germans, who had been enjoying these big encircling campaigns. And so anyway, for these reasons, the Soviet Union is able to survive. There's also a lot of Soviet soldiers. There are many more residents of the Soviet Union than a country such as Germany. And so they do not have well-trained or well-equipped soldiers, but they've got lots of them. And so anyway, they fight off the Germans, gradually retreating all the way back to the gates of Moscow. And so at the end of 1941, the Soviet Union stops the Germans at Moscow and actually launches a counterattack against them, and they save their capital. I think that the Battle of Moscow was one of the top 10 deadliest battles of World War II, one that is largely forgotten in the West. But anyway, the war, now you think about it, when you're fighting in Moscow and even further north in places like Leningrad, you really can't fight effectively when the temperature is -20, -30 degrees. And of course, the Germans have massively overextended their supply lines at this point. So between that, the weather, the damage that has already been inflicted on the Soviet Union, the war pretty much literally freezes in place in the early months of 1942. And so there's not a lot of action for those few months, and there's a lull. But meanwhile, that's not what's going on with the Pacific. Let's go on to our next slide and see what's going on out there. Thanks again, Michael. And so probably all of you know the date, December 1941, the day that Imperial Japan attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. This talk, as you all already know, is going to end with nuclear attacks conducted against Imperial Japan. When you stop and think about that, that is a pretty bold, very violent thing to unleash nuclear weapons on another country. The United States is the only one to do that. Why? Why did that happen? I mean, why were the United States and Japan even at war? I do want to take just a moment to explore that a bit. This is a much larger story that deserves, as many of these single bullets do, maybe even entire books and multiple books on them, but let's hit this really quickly. Let's go back to 1904, 1905. Imperial Japan successfully fights a war with Imperial Russia. They first sink the Imperial Russian Japanese, or I should say, a Pacific Fleet. And so the Tsar sends the Baltic fleet all the way around Europe, around the Horn of Africa, across the Indian Ocean to meet the Japanese fleet. And so he's going to try the same thing and expect a different result, which we all know is the definition of perseverance, right? And so anyway, you guessed it, the Japanese fleet annihilates the Baltic fleet of Imperial Russia as well. This emboldens the Japanese. I mean, they have taken out the entire navy of a significant European power. This emboldens them to invade continental Asia. And so they begin with Korea. Now, as we talk about some of these things, today, Korea, North Korea, South Korea, China, these countries remain very much on our radar in very different ways. Some of the issues that we have with countries like China, North Korea, etc., can be tied back at least this far, if not further. And so keep some of the things that we're about to talk about in mind as you consider current events today. So anyway, Japan invades Korea in 1905. They formally annexed the whole Korean peninsula into the empire, I believe in 1910. Now, I want to fast forward to the end of World War II. Again, not to give away our discussion today, but the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thousands of Koreans died in each of those attacks. Hundreds of Chinese died in the attack on Nagasaki, the second attack. Why were they there? You might be thinking, you know, thousands of Koreans in Japanese cities, why? Well, let's take the Korean perspective for starters. Korea had been turned more or less into a Japanese forced labor colony 40 years earlier. So we're in 1945. We go all the way back to 1905, and Japan has invaded that country. That's something the people in both North and South Korea have not forgotten to this day, and it continues to shape policy and policy decisions in all of those countries involved today. But do think about that from the Korean perspective. 40 years of forced labor, and the Koreans were in both cities, some Chinese in Nagasaki as well, being forced to turn those cities into basically massive fortresses to meet the what was perceived to be the Allied invasion that was going to come, which turned out not to be necessary, but more on that later. As you can see on our map there, the Japanese continue expansion. They take the whole of Manchuria, they take strategic portions of coastal China over the course of many years in the 20s and in the 30s. Now, if you look at that chunk of the map and you compare that, you can't see the whole globe there, but if you can imagine that chunk of space that we see there, the height of Japanese military conquest during World War II, that's a significant portion of the globe. And so Imperial Japan was a very significant player during World War II and in the years leading up to it as well, and very expansionistic. And this was very aggressive, a very violent empire. It's one of the most murderous, depending on how you look at the numbers, and we'll talk at these later, one of the more murderous regimes in modern history. So let's go back and look at expansion one more time. What finally forces the issue with the United States was the Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia, and you can see that on the map as well. These are countries today like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, etc., right? Back then, they were collectively known as French Indochina. And so these were French colonies. The people there were under French colonial rule. It was not a pleasant experience for them. Initially, they believed the Japanese propaganda, that the Japanese were coming through Asia as liberators in what turned out to be, unfortunately, a very, very brutal occupation under Japanese rule. Now, this forces the issue with the United States for a couple of reasons. First of all, we had been fierce economic rivals with the Japanese in the Pacific for decades and decades leading up to this. It was our hope in the United States that we would manufacture things here and that we would sell them to all of the people in China and make a lot of money. And so when the Japanese are going in and taking over all of these countries that are potential customers, it's bad for the bottom line. We certainly don't like that at all. The other thing that we don't like is, as I mentioned before, the Japanese occupation was very brutal, and there was clearly an emerging humanitarian crisis that was going out throughout Asia, and we didn't like that either. And so when the Japanese invaded French Indochina, that's when the United States finally imposed sanctions on the Japanese, and we imposed significant sanctions on the Japanese as well. The United States was one of the, well, I think that we were the world's leading exporter of oil back in those days. Japan was one of our big customers. We sold a lot of oil to the Japanese. If you're going to expand the empire, as you see on the map there, you're going to need American resources. So not only oil, but also scrap metal and different things of that nature. All of a sudden, we cut them off. They were not going to get those materials from the United States anymore. And without American strategic resources, what you see on the map there is really no longer sustainable. And so the Japanese are forced to make a decision. Do they apologize and go home? And no, they don't do that. They go for option B. I think, again, if you look at the map and you consider that expansion was conducted over the course of years and decades, you have a very militaristic country that is, I think, fair to say, addicted to expansion and war. So they're not going to apologize and go home. Instead, they conceive the idea for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, first of all, we've got to secure a new source of oil because it's not coming from the United States. If you look at the map again there now, you'll see that Indonesia has been taken over by the Japanese. If any of you have bought Shell products lately, filled up the car with Shell gas, I guess nobody's filled up the car lately, right? But a lot of that oil, at least historically, has come from that part of the world in Indonesia, Dutch Royal Shell, right? And so anyway, the Japanese decide, look, this is another big miscalculation of World War II. They don't think that the United States wants a war. And again, their math makes a lot of sense. They said the Americans have not helped their friends, the British or the French. They're certainly not going to come after us if we invade Indonesia. So the Americans don't want a war. Second of all, even if the Americans did want a war, they're not economically prepared for one. Keep in mind that the Great Depression had been going on for the previous decade. And so America was significantly weakened economically. They thought, you know, as an insurance policy, just to make sure that the Americans don't attack us, we will destroy the Pacific Fleet, which is largely anchored at Pearl Harbor. The Americans who are not economically prepared for a war, who don't want a war anyway, will sink their fleet, and they'll be begging us for an agreement that will finally, after all these decades, give us control of the Pacific. Now, not everybody in Japan felt that way, but that was the prevailing view at the time. And so anyway, they execute this attack on Pearl Harbor. It's remarkably successful. The entire fleet's not there, though. Some of our aircraft carriers are fortunately out at sea. But over 2,000 Americans lost their lives that day. And again, as you can see the picture from Pearl Harbor over on the right of one of our ship magazines exploding. The photograph in the middle, at the same time, just about at the same time as the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also invaded the Philippines, where we had many military units as well. And so they don't get the response that they are expecting. America is ready to fight. They are, and you know, there's a loosely translated quote, I believe, from Admiral Yamamoto, who said, you know, we may be running the risk of waking a sleeping giant. And that kind of turns out to be the case. And we'll see a little bit more on that as we go into the presentation. But because we don't have a lot of time to talk about the Pacific War, fortunately, as you see on the screen there, I have a quote that sums it up all in one short sentence. Admiral Tadaichi said, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war." The Japanese did not want a tactical victory at Pearl Harbor. They wanted a strategic victory. They wanted to begin and end the war with the Americans within a few days, maybe a few weeks. They wanted to have hegemony in the Pacific as a result of that attack very quickly, and that's not what happened. So the trivia question for you all to be thinking about as we lead up to the end of the talk in a little while, we'll get to nuclear history soon, I promise, is this. What are the great decisive Japanese victories of World War II? And if you're already starting your list with Pearl Harbor, you can't do that because, remember, a win or loss is kind of depends on what goals you set for the attack. And so Japan had hoped to end the war at Pearl Harbor, essentially, and they only started it. So I don't think that it's, you know, that tactical victory, not the strategic victory that they won. So be thinking about the great Japanese decisive victories of World War II. We're going to come back to those at the end of the talk. And so I think, Michael, if we could go to the next slide, we'll shift gears dramatically to science, which everybody here is interested in. Let's go back in time to 1938. So we're in Nazi Germany. And of course, I've mentioned Nazi Germany a couple of times. I've mentioned Hitler's name. When I mention terms like that, so I imagine that for many of you, some pretty horrific images come to mind. Of course, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, there were nearly 6 million European Jews who were murdered. And Nazi Germany also murdered an additional 6 million people. Many of them were captured soldiers, especially from the Soviet Union, gypsies, you fill in the blank, people that they just didn't like. And so this too is one of the most murderous regimes in history at, not even counting war casualties or fatalities, 6 million people murdered by Nazi Germany. That's where fission is first produced in late 1938 by Fritz Strassmann and Otto Hahn. Now, early the next year, 1939, Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch identified the process of nuclear fission. Strassmann and Hahn didn't know exactly what they had done in the experiment that they reported on, but Meitner and Frisch figured out that this is indeed fission. Now, why is fission a big deal? Well, you split the nucleus of an atom, it releases a little bit of energy. So, well, what if you could start a chain reaction of splitting the nuclei of atoms? Split a lot of nuclei of atoms. Well, you might be able to release a lot of energy. And if we're talking about releasing a lot of energy, what's that starting to sound like? Maybe a weapon, okay? And so even before fission had been produced and was interpreted as such, scientists recognized that fission might be an actual process and that you might be able to harness it in the form of some sort of weapon. And remember, this work is first being done in Nazi Germany, which was a center of many sciences, both the engineering sciences, physics, et cetera, et cetera. So let's go into our next slide and see what happens next. Now, this is, for those of you who know this story and you've heard a short version of the story before, the Manhattan Project often starts with Albert Einstein sending a letter to President Roosevelt warning him of the potential, the military potential of fission. And that's not exactly what happened. So now we're up to around, what is it on there? August 2nd. August 2nd, Albert Einstein does in fact write a letter and send it to President Roosevelt, but there's more to the story. Now, if you look at the photograph there at the bottom, that is Albert Einstein on your left, and on the right is a Hungarian physicist named Leo Szilard. Now, this is a reenactment photo that was taken after the war was over. Einstein didn't have the idea to send this letter in the first place. It was Szilard's idea to send it. Now, for your group, many of you may have heard of Leo Szilard before, but most people have not. They have no idea. He's not a household name. And that was certainly the case back in the late 1930s. Szilard was one of the scientists who had been thinking about harnessing fission in the form of a bomb for many years. I believe that he has a patent on it. I don't have access to it now because I'm at home, but I think I could probably send that to you if you'd like to see it one of these days when I get to go back to work. But Szilard recognizes, yeah, you might be able to build an atomic bomb. And I should warn the president about that because the Germans may be the first ones out of the gates in producing this new type of weapon. But Leo's got a problem, doesn't he? He's Leo Szilard, and nobody knows who he is and nobody cares. And so if he sends a letter to President Roosevelt, I think that we could probably all agree the president's not going to look at it. And so he goes to his friend Albert Einstein, who is Albert Einstein, and everybody knows him. He is a household name, certainly at that point in time and even still today. And Einstein agrees to write the letter with him. Einstein signs it, sends it to the president. And you can see page 1 there. And I would argue that this letter, not only did it not start the Manhattan Project, but it may have delayed the Manhattan Project from coming into existence, actually. And the reason why, let's read together at the bottom of page 1 of the letter. Let me see. A single bomb, so I'm halfway through the bottom paragraph there. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. Okay? Now think about that for a minute. Does that sound like a good weapon to you? And if that does sound like a good weapon to you, you get to be the skipper of the boat, taking the uranium into port at 2 knots an hour. It doesn't, you know, this is not something that you can drop out of an airplane, one bomb that fits in a plane, you can take out a city. It's a big boat full of uranium. So it doesn't sound that great to begin with. And I'm going to make it even worse by looking at history. Let's go back to 1917. Sorry for going back in time. I know that history talk should move forward, and we'll get to that soon. But in 1917, the Great War is raging in Europe. Now, back in Canada, there was a port called Halifax. Has anybody heard of the Halifax explosion before? So in the small, relatively small port, Canadian port of Halifax, there's a fully laden ship full of ammunition to take to the Western Front. But it doesn't make it out of port because the ship collides with another ship. It starts a fire aboard our ammunition boat, which burns for about 10 or 20 minutes, and then it explodes. The entire ship blows up, and it releases 3 kilotons of energy. 3,000 tons of TNT equivalent is unleashed on the port of Halifax. And you know what happens when that boat explodes? Exactly what Einstein describes in his letter. It destroys, what does he say down there? Exploded in a port might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. That is exactly what happened at Halifax, Canada in 1917. And so Einstein and Szilard have not described a futuristic, transformative weapon. They've described a more than 20-year-old accident. And so the letter is sent to the president. President Roosevelt actually sends a short reply back to Einstein a few months later, and he has one of his people there in the White House start to look into this a little bit. They create a committee in Washington. You can see there in October 1939, the First Uranium Advisory Committee, and it is given, I believe, initially $6,000 to start exploring the possibilities for fission. Now, scientists, remember, they recognize that you might be able to harness this process into some sort of weapon. But that was not the main focus early on. The main focus, the more practical idea for this new discovery was to build a reactor to produce electricity. Think about it. Think about all of the energy that you could get out of this process. We could light up cities, and that sounds like a good idea. But a new weapon, a boat, yeah, maybe not so much. So the Manhattan Project is not born, and the Uranium Advisory Committee is thinking about bombs a little bit, but much more focused on building reactors. I believe that most of that $6,000, that initial $6,000, was used to buy graphite for the world's first reactor, CP1, that was built at the University of Chicago. We'll talk about that more shortly as well. But again, right now, at this point in time, we're focused on building a reactor to produce electricity, not an atomic bomb. So let's see what happens next. Is everybody still awake, having fun, I hope? I know it's nap time, especially there. Well, how do we get the bombs from reactors? Well, as I mentioned before, the British are going to be, hey, good, Braden's still going, excellent. All right, so let's continue on. I mentioned that the Brits were going to be heroes in this, and they really are. The British are very much heroes of the Manhattan Project. Now, remember, the United Kingdom is fighting off the Germans. Basically, hey, very good. Appreciate the feedback there. I'm seeing it on the screen. The British are fighting off the Germans alone in 1941, okay? And so this is kind of an interesting part of the story to me. One thing that we greatly value at Los Alamos are the scientists who come from all over the world to work here. And that's been the way it's been at Los Alamos really since day one of our laboratory. Now, when you think about it, although the Einstein-Szilard letter didn't start the Manhattan Project, it did provide a catalyst for the federal government getting involved and starting to fund the work just a little bit. And you think about that. These were, Einstein and Szilard were not two American-born scientists. They came from Europe. Not only were they foreign-born scientists, but they came from Axis countries. And so Einstein, of course, was from Germany, and Szilard was from Hungary, as we mentioned earlier, which was aligned with Germany during World War II. Now, believe it or not, the same thing happened in the United Kingdom. You had a German named Rudolf Peierls and an Austrian who we've mentioned already during the talk, Otto Frisch. Remember, he and his aunt, I believe, Lisa Meitner, were the ones who figured out what fission was in early 1939. Peierls and Frisch send a memo to the British government saying, look, we think that you could take this new process and turn it into a super bomb. Now, two things are different. First of all, they're talking about a real deal transformative air deliverable atomic bomb that can go into combat, as opposed to Einstein and a large boat. That's one thing. The other thing is that the United States was not at war in 1939, 1940, basically the whole of 1941 as well. Britain is on the front lines of World War II, and they could get invaded by the Germans. And so this next point ties in with current proliferation issues as well. You might ask yourself today, why on earth would anybody want a nuclear weapons program? Nuclear weapons are expensive and costly, and they're damaging materials, bad for the environment and worker health. And it's a liability. You've got to take care of them. And nobody likes you if you have atomic weapons and things like that. Why on earth would any country want to deal with nuclear weapons? Well, the Brits, they recognized more than any other country in the world how close at hand nuclear weapons were and how much that they would change the world, that these were not just a different type of bigger bomb, that they were something completely different. And they recognized, you know, we're under siege by the Germans. If we can develop some of these weapons, that will probably keep the Germans out of our country. And I think that history has shown, going back to modern proliferation issues, countries with nuclear weapons don't get invaded. And that was the idea that the Brits had. So this is not just some sideshow. The British government gets this letter from Pyrrhus and Frisch, and they sponsor a feasibility study. They put together a committee, it's called the MOD Committee, to explore the feasibility of building nuclear weapons quickly. And they published their results in the summer of 1941. Even before they published their results, secretly of course, they started sharing information with American scientists. And again, this is I believe the spring of 1941. And so American scientists are just starting to think a little bit about atomic bombs, really being a significant new breakthrough technology, courtesy of the British. Now, when the British prepare their final formal report, it says, we think that you can build, again, a real deal deliverable air deliverable bomb, maybe by the end of 1943. So important things are starting to come together here. One, this is not Einstein boat. This is a good weapon. This is definitely a good weapon. If it's one bomb we can drop out of an existing plane. Another thing is it's within reach. This is not something that is 20 or 50 years away. It's something that is maybe 2 years away, maybe even less. Turns out it took a little bit longer, but you've got a transformative technology that is within reach. Now, about the same time that the MOD Committee finalizes its report, Hitler invades the Soviet Union. And we talked about that earlier, but what do you think the reaction back in London was? You think that the Brits were excited? Oh, we've got an ally now. The Soviet Union's on our side. We're going to win. No, that's not what they thought. Now, remember, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union because of how poorly the Soviet Union did in Finland. The Nazis, the Germans, Hitler, his military, however we want to phrase it, right? Hitler didn't think that the Soviet Union would last more than 2 or 3 months. That's why they invaded. We had military attaches in Moscow. We didn't think that the Soviet Union would last, and the Brits didn't either. And so the Brits were not particularly excited about this new development for 2 reasons. First of all, they didn't like the Soviet Union, didn't trust them. Even if they had the common enemy of Adolf Hitler, you know, these were not our friends. And the other reason, of course, was, well, they're not going to be around in 3 months anyway, probably. How are we going to survive and maybe even win the war someday? Well, the thought in Britain was, we really need to get the United States involved. But how? Well, they've already been sharing, kind of on the side, secrets with American scientists as they were preparing the MOD Committee report. We get to the fall of 1941, and a secret British mission arrives in the United States led by Sir Henry Tizard. And they have many secret British reports, including a copy of the MOD Committee report. The idea here is that we'll share the MOD Committee report with the United States government. They'll look at it. They'll recognize the peril of a Nazi nuclear monopoly. Because remember, the Brits, us, everybody, we don't know what the Germans are up to, and they were the first to produce fission. and they're not being bombed by anybody, right? Uh, they think if we can show the Americans that Hitler could have a nuclear monopoly tomorrow, maybe they'll jump into the war on our side. And so the first person who gets a copy of the Bond Committee report in Washington locks it in a safe because it looks dangerous and it can't hurt anybody in a safe. And it sits there for weeks until a second person named Vannevar Bush gets it. So some of you who know a little bit about the Manhattan Project may have heard Bush's name. He's in charge of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the OSRD. At the end of 1941, he's looking at this report and deciding and realizes maybe our focus has been in the wrong place. We know that you might have been able to build some kind of bomb, but we didn't realize that it was going to be like a real city-destroying bomb that could be deliverable and might be ready very soon. And so just as we're starting to think, just as we start to get advocates in Washington who might be able to get us focused on building an atomic bomb, then to complete this first circle of history, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor 10 days, 2 weeks later after that. And so the United States is now at war, which is what the Brits wanted. But this turns out to be a massive distraction for the bomb work that was about to get started. Now, the Germans were formally allied with Imperial Japan at this point in time. And so the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Their allies, the Germans, declare war on the United States. And so think about it, what it was like to be in the United States in the opening months of 1942. Yeah, we're ready to fight, but the economy's not doing great. We've got to gear up to fight. Where are we going to try and take the fight? You know, how are we going to respond to the Japanese with most of the Pacific Fleet heavily damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor? How are we going to respond to the Germans? And so the early months of 1942, we were just trying to stabilize a very, very chaotic situation. But again, as those months go by, now we've got scientists who are thinking about atomic bombs more. We have people in Washington who recognize the stakes, and the Manhattan Project is getting awfully ripe for coming into existence by the summer of 1942. Finally, in August of 1942, I believe it may have been August 10th or something like that, the order the order that created the Manhattan Project was issued to the Army, and I think that it was that it went into effect a few days later. So mid-August 1942 is the birth date, or mid-month, whatever, of the Manhattan Project. So the Army Corps of Engineers gets this project because they recognize pretty quickly in the summer of 1942, you know, this is not a job for a little committee in Washington and $6,000 bucks. We need a government entity that runs big projects, maybe national projects with many sites, that knows how to build things and can get things quickly, done quickly, hence the Army Corps of Engineers. The initial leader of the Manhattan Project didn't last very long. He was quickly replaced by General Leslie R. Groves. And General Groves, who you see there pictured on the right, he was selected, he was a colonel at the time for a variety of reasons. And I should mention, for those of you who are wondering where the name Manhattan Project comes from, when the Army Corps of Engineers gets this project, well, they need a headquarters somewhere. And as it turns out, they had some office space available in Manhattan. So they decide to set up shop there. And I guess to keep it secret and to throw the enemy off, they secretly call it the Manhattan Project. So the Manhattan Project is named after its own headquarters. Not sure if that's the best code name that's ever been generated, but that's where it starts. And so going back to Colonel Groves was a highly educated, experienced Army engineer. And he got the job probably primarily because of his previous project. His previous project was building the Pentagon. So everybody knows what the Pentagon is. Some of you may have been to Washington, seen it, maybe been inside the Pentagon. Pretty significant structure, and it's pretty impressive when you consider General Groves' accomplishment. Construction time on the Pentagon was only 18 months. From when they started building to the time that the building was done, only a year and a half for that massive structure to be completed. And so General Groves gets the Manhattan Project. And do you think he's excited about it? No, he's not excited about it. He's a career military officer. It's World War II, and he wants to go fight. Everybody in the country wanted to go fight. You had 15-year-olds saying that they were 17, 18 years old so that they could go and fight in the Army or in the Navy. So anyway, General Groves is not happy with this new with this new project, this new assignment that he's been given, but he accepts his orders and he immediately starts to negotiate. So what do you think that the first thing that he negotiates is? That's right, a promotion. Because he says, you know, look, I'm a colonel. You're telling me that my project could win the war, maybe save the world, and you're going to entrust that kind of responsibility with a colonel. And so they promote him to general. You'll notice that he's got a couple of stars there on his shoulder. He gets star number 1 in September of 1942. General Groves next negotiates an unlimited budget. And so those are words that we don't hear very often at Los Alamos National Laboratory, not sure about there in Michigan, but he negotiates an unlimited budget. And the other thing that he gets is top billing for war materials. Back during World War II, everything was rationed. If you were going to get oil, metal, if you were going to have access to the top scientists available, you'd better have a pretty good reason. And General Groves got top priority for getting anything he needed to get the project done. And so now we've got a very competent, highly motivated general who's taken over this project. And we're going to run through the next 3 slides pretty quickly. Michael, if you could take us to the next one. The Manhattan Project was, as you can see, a national effort. At one point in its history, it simultaneously employed 125,000 people, and it's been estimated that as many as 500,000 people worked for the Manhattan Project at one point or another. And so Los Alamos, we'll talk about Los Alamos shortly, but I want to make sure everybody knows that the Manhattan Project was the product of many people from really not only from around the country, but from around the world as well. And we'll see if we can get some of our international scientists involved in this a little bit more later. Let's go to our next slide. This one's going to be really quick. Now, if you're going to build an atomic bomb, you're going to need fuel for it. And so General Groves has an unlimited budget, right? And so, well, we could use uranium or we could make plutonium. Do both. He can afford it. And so we're going to enrich uranium at the Clinton Engineer Works, more commonly known simply as Oak Ridge. Today, Y-12, but we will stick with Oak Ridge for now. This site is set up in eastern Tennessee. And remember, it's one of the 3 main sites of the Manhattan Project, but there are many, many other sites as well. There was nothing in Oak Ridge, Tennessee to speak of. There was almost nothing there. All of a sudden, it becomes one of the larger cities in Tennessee. And the building that you see there, pictured in the bottom, that is the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant for enriching uranium. That building was put up in a matter of months, and it was the largest building ever constructed at that point in time. And that's just one building at one site of the Manhattan Project, okay? Let's go on to our next slide. We're going to make plutonium as well. Now, I think we've got this coming up in another slide. We'll see in a moment. But the Manhattan Project produced a couple of history's greatest scientific experiments. One of them was conducted December 2nd, 1942. Enrico Fermi, who was an Italian Nobel laureate, he was at the University of Chicago. He took the $6,000-ish worth of graphite, used it to construct the world's first nuclear reactor, and it went critical that day. They proved that you could initiate a controlled nuclear chain reaction. That's a pretty big deal. That's one of those experiments that opens up the next era in human history, it being, of course, the atomic age. Now, we're going to make plutonium in a reactor. And by the way, I should mention, one of the reasons why that experiment was a big deal for the Manhattan Project is if you can produce a controlled nuclear chain reaction, you know that you can also produce an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction. An uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction, of course, being an atomic bomb. Now, Fermi's reactor, it was really not ideal for production, but at Oak Ridge, they did set up what is today, it's still there if you ever find yourself in Tennessee and can visit it, the X-10 reactor. This was kind of the practice, the prototype production reactor that was based largely on Enrico Fermi's reactor. So they're working the X-10 reactor in Tennessee, and they're going to take that type of reactor to Hanford in Washington State, and they're going to produce that many times over in order to make plutonium from the uranium. And so that was the big job at Hanford, even though the prototype reactor for making plutonium was in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So we've got Oak Ridge, we've got Hanford, and on our next slide, we finally get to Los Alamos. And so you don't have an atomic bomb without fuel, but you can have all the fuel in the world, but if you don't know how to unleash its energy, then you're not going to be very successful either. That's the role of Los Alamos in World War II. The Manhattan Project needed a weapons design laboratory, a laboratory that could design, build, test, and help to deliver the world's first atomic bombs in combat. That was the job. Now, even before the site for Los Alamos was selected, the director of the Weapons Design Laboratory was selected. And many of you probably know him, or know his name, I should say. There's a picture of him there, J. Robert Oppenheimer. And so initially, they didn't think that the Weapons Design Laboratory would be that big, that it wouldn't need that many people, and Oppenheimer could surely handle the job. Why hire J. Robert Oppenheimer? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, many of America's great scientists were already involved in the Manhattan Project. People who had won Nobel Prizes like Ernest Lawrence and Arthur Compton, they were already involved elsewhere. We don't want to have to pull them away from their work and disrupt what's going on. And so question one is, who's really bright and who's still available? Oppenheimer fits both those categories. He's available to lead somewhere, lead a part of the project. The other thing is he's considered to be exceptionally bright. Oppenheimer was considered by many to be America's leading theoretical physicist at that point in time. And so he seems like a really good option. Now, why would you not want J. Robert Oppenheimer to be the director of your laboratory facility? Well, I can think of a couple of reasons that you would not. First of all is he has zero management experience. Now think about that for a moment. Oppenheimer is going to be in charge of an entire laboratory and he's never led anything before. Well, yeah, but the laboratory is going to be small. Again, only need 100 people or so. Surely he can grow into the position. Well, our technical staff grew to, I think we peaked at about 1,700 technical staff members during the war. So it grew quite a bit larger than they initially realized. Another reason that Oppenheimer, you might not want him to lead your lab is that he was considered a significant security risk. Back in the 1930s, when the Great Depression was going on, communism looked like a really good idea. You had upwards of 30% of people out of work. Of course, we have high unemployment now, but a lot of those workers are furloughed. They have jobs, hopefully, that they can return to very soon. In the Great Depression, you had 30% of the population that had no job and no prospects of a job, maybe for years. And so when you don't have a job and when you don't have the social safety nets that we have now, when you don't know where the next meal for your child is coming from, would you be willing to look at something differently? Maybe a different way of doing things? Well, a lot of people in this country were interested in communism because it looked like a good idea. People didn't know what was going on in the Soviet Union. We mentioned Stalin earlier and some of his crimes. It's estimated that Stalin murdered between 5 and 20 million of his own people, either through direct or indirect means. But you didn't hear that if you were in the United States at that point in time. You just heard that, hey, here everybody is free and equal and has something to eat and a place to live and a job. That sounds like a good deal to me if I'm living in the United States during the Great Depression. Oppenheimer was interested in communism. His first serious girlfriend was a member of the Communist Party. They went to communist meetings together. Although Robert Oppenheimer didn't join the Communist Party, he contributed to communist-friendly organizations. Well, when Stalin helped Hitler start World War II, a lot of people, including Oppenheimer, quickly and completely backed away from the cause now that people could see the true nature of that horrible regime and that ideology. But anyway, Oppenheimer is now going to be the director at Los Alamos. He's got to get a security clearance. All of his friends, his wife, Kitty, his brother, Frank, they're all either members of the Communist Party or former members of the Communist Party. That does not help you get a clearance. And they didn't want to give him one. But General Groves, who was kind of the political opposite just about of Robert Oppenheimer, these two guys, despite their differences, they really hit it off. They highly respected each other. I'd stop short of saying that they were friends, but they really thought highly of each other. They liked each other. And General Groves saw incredible talent incredible intellect in J. Robert Oppenheimer. And even though Oppenheimer had never led anything before, General Groves, one of his strengths as a manager was his ability to delegate, to see talent where maybe other people didn't. And so General Groves personally intervened, ensured that Oppenheimer got a clearance, but also made sure that he was watched at all times. So Oppenheimer was secretly monitored while he was at the laboratory, and unfortunately for years after as well. A story for a different day. But anyway, as we run through this slide, because we want to keep our story going, Oppenheimer he selects Los Alamos. He plays a part in selecting Los Alamos. Now, where are we going to put the Secret Weapons Design Laboratory? Well, first of all, it's got to be far inland. Well, we're in the mountains of New Mexico here. We are far inland, okay? Not a problem there. I guess that they wanted to prevent potential saboteurs, maybe being landed by, maybe a commando being landed by a German or Japanese submarine to go blow up a factory. Look, we want to make that commando run an awful long way. So let's be far inland where we can't be bombed or sabotaged or something like that. Isolated. Even today, New Mexico, where we are here, we're about 35 miles northwest of Santa Fe. Pretty isolated today. There are no direct flights from where you are here to Los Alamos. There are not many direct flights from anywhere else except maybe Albuquerque. And so anyway, it's isolated. There were not that many people who lived in this area on the eve of the Manhattan Project starting up work here. So we didn't have to evict, the government didn't have to evict too many people. There were some homesteaders who lived in the area, and there was a school for boys here. But that was about it. You're looking at maybe evicting a couple hundred people, not a couple thousand or more. And so for these reasons and others, Los Alamos looks like a good idea, but Los Alamos was actually not the first choice. General Groves, Oppenheimer, some other Manhattan Project officials came to New Mexico. They visited a place about a 45-minute drive to our west called Jemez Springs and decided that it was not defensible enough. Jemez Springs kind of sits in a bowl, and they didn't like that. They wanted the high ground to be able to guard and defend and try and keep people out. And so Oppenheimer, who was familiar with New Mexico, suggested Los Alamos. And so it's been said that Oppenheimer's two great loves in life were physics and New Mexico. For those of you who've not been able to visit here, it really is a wonderful place. The climate is lovely here. We've got a nice, cool 80-degree day today. It's nice and dry, wide open spaces, some of the cleanest air that you can breathe probably anywhere in the world we get to enjoy here. Lots of history, interesting topography. Oppenheimer and his brother Frank, they were from a wealthy family. They bought a cabin not far from Santa Fe, which is still standing, spent a lot of time here and fell in love with the area, knew it. And that's why Oppenheimer knew about Los Alamos, even though there was almost nothing there. Now, the topography of Los Alamos is, everybody take their hand and put it on a flat surface, and you have a map of Los Alamos. Los Alamos is a series of mesa tops, the tops of your fingers, with canyons running between them. That's what it is. And so Los Alamos, the town, the laboratory, was set up on top of these mesas, and you could safely conduct high explosives testing on distant mesas, or better yet, even down in the canyons where people could be protected from them. And so Los Alamos was defensible and really looked like an ideal place to set up shop. And so they did. The laboratory was hastily built in the opening months of 1943. The homesteaders and the boys' ranch school, the students, the staff, they were evicted in December of 1942. And we were ready for our first major technical conference to begin at Los Alamos on, I believe it was April 5th, 1943. That was known as the Primer Conference. And basically what they did was they kind of baselined their knowledge of all things nuclear science. What do we know about nuclear science, and how can we turn it into a bomb? That seminar, that conference, if you will, was presided over by a scientist named Robert Serber. The lectures were collected together and turned into the first Los Alamos report, LA1, Los Alamos Report number 1, the Los Alamos Primer. We've published a few more since. And so anyway, that is what's going on at Los Alamos. Now you can see on the slide that we have up right now, the race for the atomic bomb. We really didn't know what the Germans or Japanese were up to. Both Germany and Japan had nuclear weapons programs. And they were roughly on par with each other. I'm not an expert on either of those programs. I know a little bit about them, but they didn't really come close to building an actual, neither program, to building an actual nuclear bomb. to producing substantial amounts of nuclear fuel for atomic bombs and things of that nature. But we didn't know that. The British didn't know that. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, we didn't have a lot of intelligence assets in Nazi Germany involved, especially in that line of work. The other thing was, well, there wasn't a whole lot of information to be gathered, because remember, here in the United States, you've got, you know, hundreds of thousands of people working on this project that's all over the country. But that's not what you see in Germany or Japan. You don't see these massive facilities going up. What are they doing there? Enriching uranium, you know, things like that. So there wasn't a lot to spy on, and we didn't have a lot of help on the ground giving us information on those projects as well. But meanwhile, as we talked about already, as the boys' school and as the homesteaders were being evicted, Enrico Fermi was initiating the world's first nuclear chain reaction. I think I may have given you the wrong date earlier, but as you see on the slide there, that's correct. December 2nd, 1942. Now, a little bit of insider information that you can't find in history books. You see Fermi's team there on the right. Now, Enrico Fermi is the scientist standing first row on the left, okay? And if you look on the at the illustration on the left, that's a charcoal picture of the experiment. There are no photos from the actual experiment, the world's first nuclear chain reaction. We just have these charcoal drawings. And as you can see, that's kind of dramatic. Maybe the charcoal gives it that effect. But anyway, I asked Harold Agnew. Harold was the third director of Los Alamos. He was a friend of mine. He passed away back, I believe, in 2013. But Harold was on Fermi's team. In fact, if you look behind Fermi, right over his right shoulder in the tweed suit there with the black tie, that's Harold Agnew, who was a graduate student under Fermi. We asked Harold one time, what was it like to be in the room for the world's first nuclear chain reaction? I mean, that's arguably history's greatest single scientific experiment. And Harold said, well, you know, it was one of Fermi's experiments. We knew it was going to work. We went to lunch. So that's the real story of what it was like to be there. Harold said, yeah, you're these people talking about how, ooh, we changed the world. He said, that was a bunch of baloney. We went to lunch. But anyway, that's the inside story, but a significant part of the story, obviously. Now, with their work at, let me see that quick. Can I ask what Harold Agnew, Harold Melvin Agnew. And so anyway, you see him in the picture there. With their work done at the University of Chicago, that freed up Harold and Enrico Fermi to come here to Los Alamos. Before we leave this slide, I want to point out a couple of other things that you might be interested in. Do you see the woman in the second row there? Her name is Leona Marshall Libby, and she wrote a really entertaining book called, what is The Uranium People, I believe. But anyway, look that up. It'll be a fun read for you. And to her left, you see the man standing there in the trench coat. That is Leo Szilard, who we were talking about earlier. So let's go on to our next slide. Michael, are we doing good on time so far? I think.
Yeah, I've been scheduled until 4:30.
Okay, cool. I think we're going to make it. Maybe not as much time for Q&A, unfortunately, but I will give everyone my email address if we run out of time. We don't have a lot of time to talk about this. Los Alamos is still in the global security business today. That started in World War II. You know, the United States, we were worried about the Germans. Is Hitler building an atomic bomb? How can we locate the facility? Well, what better asset to use for locating a clandestine nuclear weapons laboratory than your own clandestine nuclear weapons laboratory? So the government turned to Los Alamos for help in this. I think that Los Alamos inadvertently invented the dirty bomb. And so you can see William Parsons there. He was a Navy captain, Captain Parsons. He was concerned that the Germans might take a conventional rocket, something like a V-1 or something like that, and lace it with radioactive poisonous materials. And you can see the title of his memo that he sent to General Groves, and he copied his boss Oppenheimer on it. Subject, possible use of radioactive poison in rocket-propelled unmanned aircraft. That is, at least to my knowledge, one of the earliest, maybe the earliest written down formal concept for a dirty bomb. So fortunately, the Germans didn't come up with that idea, but Deke Parsons did. But we did some other work. Louis Alvarez, who you see there, Louis was one of our 18 Nobel laureates who was here during World War II. Most of them won their prizes after the war. Most of these folks were quite young during World War II when they were at the laboratory. But anyway, Louis responded to intelligence taskings. As I mentioned, he won a Nobel Prize, and completely unrelated to all that, he also was the manager of the detonator program here at the laboratory during the war. And he and his son Walter co-postulated the asteroid impact theory for the extinction of dinosaurs. So that's just one guy at wartime Los Alamos. But let's keep going on to, let's see what we've got next. I think we've got, okay, this is an important slide. We're going to run through bomb design really quickly for today. And don't ask me a bunch of technical questions. I may not be able to answer them. But anyway, this is in the beginning at Los Alamos. The idea was to build 2 gun-type nuclear weapons, okay? With a gun-type nuclear weapon, we're going to take one subcritical piece of material and shoot it at another subcritical piece of nuclear material. Sounds pretty easy and straightforward, right? And that's why they liked it. We'll take some enriched uranium, we'll take some plutonium, and we'll just shoot them at each other in a gun barrel, and we'll get nice mushroom clouds. It'll be easy. As it turns out, it was not that easy. And so the initial main bomb of World War II, which not too many people have heard of, was called Thin Man. Thin Man was going to be the plutonium gun. Okay, so remember Thin Man. The backup plan, largely because it used enriched uranium, was Little Boy. And all of you have probably heard of Little Boy before. Little Boy is going to be the enriched uranium gun weapon. Okay, the reason it's the backup plan is because it was a lot harder to enrich a lot of uranium than it was to make plutonium. You don't need as much plutonium to make a nuclear weapon. And so that's why Thin Man is perfect. It's the best of both worlds. It's simple from an engineering standpoint, and it uses plutonium, which we can make quite a bit more easily, and which is a much more material to use in your nuclear weapon. And so we fast forward to the spring of 1944. We have another Italian Nobel laureate named Emilio Segre. He was performing experiments at the laboratory that revealed you could not use plutonium in a gun-assembled nuclear weapon. Now remember, enriched uranium and plutonium are both really nice materials for making a nuclear weapon, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily all that similar. Very different types of material. Plutonium is a much more active material. It's warm to the touch. There's lots of neutrons in flux, and that's the problem. If you shoot one piece of plutonium at another piece of plutonium, it'll go prompt critical before the projectile reaches its target because of all the neutrons in flux. The bomb won't assemble and explode. You'll just get a little explosion. Remember, with a nuclear weapon, we want this to happen, you know, boom. In Thin Man, this is going to happen. Can't have that. And so this, not only have we lost Thin Man, we've lost the main bomb of World War II, and we're down to the backup plan, which is Little Boy. Now what do we do? Well, I wouldn't want to be Oppenheimer and have to call up General Groves and explain this minor setback to him. Now, fortunately, Oppenheimer had allowed a few of the scientists to look at an alternate means of assembling a nuclear weapon called implosion. And so instead of shooting things at each other, in an imploding bomb, we'll take our plutonium, we'll fabricate it into a sphere, right? And we're going to surround it with a lot of high explosives, embed detonators all over the high explosives. And the detonators will go off, they will set off the high explosives. The explosives will perfectly evenly and symmetrically compress the plutonium core, and we'll get an even better, more efficient, more powerful nuclear explosion. Sounds good, right? But here's the problem. In the spring of 1944, almost nobody had been working on this. They had not been thinking of spherical implosion. They had been thinking about imploding cylinders of materials, taking cylinders and wrapping them in high explosives. And it really was just a sideshow that Oppenheimer tolerated because, you know, we're trying to win a war. We're in a race with Hitler to build an atomic bomb. Hundreds of Americans were being killed in combat every single day. We can't spare anybody. Well, a few people were allowed to look at this. Oppenheimer, you know, the other problem here is that an imploding nuclear bomb is a lot more difficult. Think about the word explosives. Explosives are supposed to expand. They expand, releasing energy outward. In an imploding bomb, we want to take a crude material, wartime high explosives, and we want to try and make them do the exact opposite thing that they were originally designed to do. And we want to do it fast. We want them to implode. Well, who are the scientists who are real experts on imploding things and hydrodynamics? There were virtually none of them. The three that we had that were exceptionally talented were the famous Hungarian mathematician John von Neumann, Rudolf Peierls, who we met earlier in the talk, and a German named Klaus Fuchs, who turned out to be a spy. And that is a story for a different day as well. And so anyway, Oppenheimer quickly reorganizes the laboratory to build a much more complex imploding bomb. Again, the payoff is immense if we can make one of these work, but making one of these works is really going to be a problem. The other thing was, Little Boy, which is our gun uranium weapon, since it's pretty simple, they could put it into combat with certainty, knowing that it would work without even doing a full-scale nuclear test. They were able to do criticality experiments and smaller scale experiments to ensure that Little Boy would work. But again, it's horribly inefficient. You can't just crank out Little Boy bombs. It's going to take a while to make that much enriched uranium just for one of them. So we really do need that quick punch. We don't want, the enemy, we need to show them that not only do we have an irresistible transformative new weapon, but that it's not just some gimmick that we can make every 5 years. We can rapidly reproduce these things. So we need the plutonium bomb to work, and we need it to work very quickly. And so anyway, because it was more complicated and there was less certainty in the design of the imploding bomb, which we will now call Fat Man, which you've all heard about, they decided pretty early on that an actual full-scale test would need to be conducted on one of these devices before it entered combat. Let's go on to our next slide. We're getting down to, starting to get down to the end of the talk today. So Trinity. Trinity was the code name for the world's first nuclear explosion. Now I've got an hour, well, 2 hours now, I think, of Trinity. And so maybe next time we do this, we can talk about this test if you're interested. This is arguably history's greatest experiment as well. And I'm sorry that we don't have enough time to give it the attention that it deserves. But anyway, the Trinity test was conducted July 16th, 1945, 75 years ago next month. You can see, actually, Michael, that middle picture is a video. I don't know if the video will play on here. Could you give it a shot, though? And we'll see. This is not the Trinity test that you're watching. This is the rehearsal test. It was called the 100-ton test. Because if you're going to set off a nuclear bomb, don't you think it would be a good idea to practice? And so they set off approximately 100 tons of TNT on May 7th, 1945. And that's what you see there. They laced it with radioactive material that could be traced. Now, two things came out of the rehearsal test. First, the diagnostics for measuring the test and collecting data were way off. They were like a quarter second off, which when you're trying to time the early stages of a nuclear bomb, a quarter second is an eternity. The other thing is, remember those radioactive materials that they laced the pile with? They figured out that nuclear fallout was going to be a much bigger problem than they had originally anticipated as well. Now, interestingly, if you look at the slides there, May 7th, they conduct this small-scale test. By the way, on the left, that picture, those are the 100 tons of TNT and the workers who stacked them. On the right, you see our second director, Norris Bradbury, who succeeded J. Robert Oppenheimer, standing next to the Trinity gadget, the code name for the imploding test device. The day after the rehearsal test, the 100-ton test, Nazi Germany formally surrendered. Okay? Trinity was conducted July 16th. So a couple of months before Trinity, a little bit more than that, Nazi Germany quits. Hitler's dead. The Japanese, now I want to go back before we go to the next slide and ask you, what are the great decisive Japanese victories of World War II? Well, there really aren't that many. There's some kind of limited victories sprinkled around in there. There are a couple of draws, but the Allies defeated the Japanese in major Pacific battle after major Pacific battle, pushing them back to the Japanese home islands. And the Allies did it with a tiny fraction of their overall resources. Most of those resources were put into defeating Hitler in Europe. Now think about that for a minute. If we're defeating the Japanese in all of these battles with a tiny fraction of our resources, now we can put like the other 90% of our resources into the Pacific War against Japan. Who's going to win? I think it's pretty clear. The Allies are going to win, with or without a nuclear bomb. We'll talk about that in a few more minutes. But anyway, the Japanese, even though the Germans had been defeated, the Japanese were unwilling to surrender, knowing that they were going to lose the war. They continued to fight on. So as the war rages in the Pacific, we go to the next slide, to Trinity, and as you can see, it worked. The world's first man-made nuclear explosion successfully detonated at 5:30 that morning. As I mentioned before, there's a great long story behind this that we don't have time for today, but this test produced a yield of 21,000 tons of TNT equivalent. And so, I forgot the weight. The weight is, the weight of the plutonium is published in a government publication. It is unclassified, but I don't want to give you the wrong number on that. But with just a few kilograms of plutonium, you could now unleash 21,000 tons of TNT equivalent energy. And you can see the early fireball exploding in the photographs that you see there. I have a short video clip of Oppenheimer. We don't have time for that today, and that's my fault. I apologize. Michael, if you don't mind, you can share these slides, of course, with anyone who's interested. You can see Oppenheimer reflecting on the Trinity test and how it was going to change history. But anyway, let's go on and talk about the end of World War II. Oh, before we do, actually, another slide on Trinity. There is Oppenheimer. That's right, it was a few kilograms. I forget if it was 6, somewhere in that range, but I appreciate the comment down there. Now, you see Oppenheimer and General Groves standing at the footing for the tower. By the way, when you saw Bradbury on the previous slide with the gadget, they're at the top of a 100-foot steel tower, hoping to cut down on fallout. That didn't work that well, at Trinity at least. The other reason was that if you set the bomb up on top of the tower, you get those nice symmetrical pictures of the fireball exploding, as opposed to just setting a bomb up on the ground and getting a bunch of dirt thrown up. And we need clear pictures of the fireball because you can measure the fireball and get a very precise measurement of the yield. And that's important because this is a science experiment, right? But it's also kind of a test of a combat weapon that's about to go into war as well. Oppenheimer and Groves there is, I'll come back to that. Sonny, ask me that question for Q&A in a few minutes, because I do want to get through our slides really quickly. So Oppenheimer and Groves visited the Trinity site in September, just a few months after the test. What you see there is that that rebar had been in concrete at holding the footing in place for that 100-foot steel tower. Now, the bomb was so powerful that it pushed the ground down, exposed the concrete, blasted it away, and just left the rebar there. And if you're thinking, well, this picture was only taken a couple months later, I mean, isn't there like residual radiation and things like that? Yes, but if you'll notice carefully at General Groves there, he's wearing his nice little booties that are keeping him safe, so nothing to worry about. You see an aerial view over there on the right. The little dot down in the bottom right-hand corner, that little dot is where they did the 100-ton test. 100 tons of TNT made that little dot on the ground. And of course, the central focus of the picture there is ground zero for the Trinity test. That's what a few kilograms of plutonium will do. The reason that the ground is dark there is that when the fireball expanded, it consumed desert sand, melted the desert sand in the fireball, and then the liquid desert sand rained back down to the earth. And when it got back down to the ground, it gradually re-solidified into this greenish glass-like material, which we call trinitite. And that is actually what you see, the trinitite there, change the color of the ground. Let's go into another slide really quickly. And I think we're gonna have to run through these faster than I would like, because the end of World War II and the use of nuclear weapons is a very important discussion that we can have in full a different day if you would like. But just to run through these so we can at least get a couple of questions in, I hope. Remember, Hitler's been knocked out of the war. The Japanese are still fighting, even though they are going to lose. We had tried just about everything to try and end the war with the Japanese. We, the United States, didn't want this war in the first place. We had defeated the Japanese in battle after battle in the Pacific. They chose not to surrender. We were able to start conventionally bombing Japan in late 1944. Before then, we really couldn't effectively bomb Japan from China back before that. So there were bombing raids, but not of any huge significance. That changed in late 1944 when we captured islands where we could launch big strikes with hundreds of B-29 bombers against the Japanese. And so we used conventional bombings. I believe that it was codenamed Operation Meeting House in March of 1945. 100,000 people were killed in Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The Japanese chose not to surrender after that. Of course, the Allies, as we closed in, we took islands, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the first really of the home Japanese islands as well. The Japanese chose not to surrender. And finally, President Truman knew that we had working atomic bombs at the Potsdam Conference. This was the conference where he met with Churchill and Stalin after the collapse of Nazi Germany. And at the conclusion of that conference in mid-July, later July of 1945, he warned the Japanese. He said, you will surrender unconditionally or you will face prompt and utter destruction. He did not specifically mention nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons are very much a psychological weapon. As I mentioned Operation Meeting House a while ago, the United States was very good at producing immense casualties using conventional means. That had not convinced the Japanese to surrender. We didn't want to have to fight the Japanese conventionally in Japan. Remember, the Koreans, the Chinese are being forced to turn their major cities in southern Japan into big fortresses to meet an invasion. And to give you some specific numbers, the Allies defeated Germany using conventional means at awful cost. During World War II, over 300 Americans were killed every single day in combat on average, and the United States was lucky. The Soviet Union, which was our ally of convenience during World War II, lost between 15, was it 15? Yeah, the Soviet Union lost between 15 and 20,000 people as a result of military action every single day. We were tired of war. We wanted it to end. The Japanese chose to essentially respond to President Truman's threat of prompt and utter destruction by, if this is an official thing, by formally ignoring it. So what do? Do we invade Japan? That doesn't sound like a good option. Do we blockade Japan? Well, we were already kind of blockading Japan, and that wasn't working either. We've got atomic weapons, and atomic weapons are a little bit different. You can see some of the lists of potential target cities there. Eventually, the Manhattan Project is given Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, Kokura, and Niigata. Those of you who are familiar with Japan might be thinking Kyoto, that's not really a military center. That's a center of history and culture. And that's why General Groves in particular wanted to attack it. He wanted to send a very psychological message to the Japanese. If you don't surrender now and completely, we'll not only destroy your country, we'll destroy your history and your heritage and everything. But the Secretary of War said, okay, we're not going to do that. Kyoto is not a military target. And I spent my honeymoon there, and I'd kind of like to go back and visit one of these days. But anyway, we're basically looking primarily at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Kokura. Let's go to our next slide. Michael, I'm sorry about the time. My mistake for running so long on this. So anyway, the idea, as I mentioned before, and you can see from the Target Committee report up there at the top, the psychological factors involved in target selection. Because again, we can do death and destruction. We can do that already. But atomic bombs are something different. And so the idea was we want to shock the Japanese with this entirely new weapon. Well, what's the difference anyway between, if I send 500, 1,000 planes to Tokyo and kill 100,000 people, I mean, is there really that big a difference between using an atomic bomb? And there is. Now, the Japanese have proven time and time again, they didn't mind fighting. They didn't mind dying in combat. And when I send 500 or 1,000 planes to your city, you can fight back using conventional means. You can scrape together some fighters. You can man the anti-aircraft guns. You can sound the alarm. You can, well, thank you, John. You can hide in a bunker. There's countermeasures for a conventional bombing raid. But what are the countermeasures for an atomic bomb? There are none. One plane could just instantly appear and drop one bomb out in a moment and take out a city, what had been a healthy, thriving city. And so in addition to causing death and destruction, this was also the first irresistible weapon that was seen in the war. The Japanese military did not have a chance to fight back against these new weapons. And so anyway, as you can see General Groves' quote from his memoir, this was written after the fact, Admiral Purnell and I had often discussed the importance of having the second bomb follow the first one, or the second blow follow the first one quickly so that the Japanese would not have time to recover their balance. There's a couple of reasons for using, for why General Groves thought it would take 2 atomic bombs to end the war. The first one is to produce that shock of an entirely new class of weapon that can't be resisted. The second bomb, we'll talk about that when we get to Nagasaki. But before we do, let's go to our next slide and talk about Hiroshima. Yeah, hey, very good. And we'll run through these very quickly. So Hiroshima was chosen as the target for the first strike. It was a military target. I still hear people today saying that Hiroshima was not. Hiroshima was being fortified. It was the home of a major military headquarters. I believe that there were 31,000 military personnel in the area of destruction at Hiroshima. It was a city in southern Japan. That's one of the big obstacles that an Allied invasion would have encountered if they invaded. So at least by my standard, Hiroshima was certainly a military target. For this attack, Little Boy would be used. This is our gun-assembled uranium weapon. This mission is going to be flown by Colonel Paul Tibbets. And you can see Paul Tibbets and his crew. Looking at that photo, Colonel Tibbets is standing. He is the second from the right there. The Enola Gay gets its name from his mother. He knew that the plane was probably going to become a historical artifact. It has. You can still see it, I believe, at the National Air and Space Museum, not far from Washington, D.C. He wanted to make sure that it had a unique name for its unique mission, so he named it after his mother. And as we'll see on the next slide, this mission went just like clockwork. It was launched the morning of August 6, 1945. I think it was shortly after 8 that morning, the bomb detonated approximately 1,800 feet above the city. The reason for setting it off at high altitude was to maximize the amount of blast damage coming down from the bomb and to minimize the amount of radiological damage. Remember, whatever the fireball comes in contact with, whether it's desert sand at Trinity or whether it's buildings or anything else, radioactive particles are going to attach themselves to any kind of debris or anything else, and it's going to be ejected into the atmosphere, and those irradiated particles are going to fall on somebody, hence the term fallout. So that's why the bombs were detonated at altitude. Little Boy was substantially, well, I guess you could say substantially weaker than Fat Man at 15 kilotons versus 21. Now you will see casualty fatality numbers all over the place. The number that I use, 64,500 died as a result of one bomb going off by the end of 1945. That number comes from a 1954 U.S. Army pathological study. So it is an actual government scientific study, and I think that it's credible. And I do apologize if if my approach is clinical. I don't have a way to quantify the violence and the pain and suffering of 64,500 people being killed. But this was a terrible new weapon, and that was the whole point, was to show the enemy that further resistance is futile. So as we mentioned and have mentioned multiple times now, thousands of Koreans and at least 10 American POWs died in this attack, which destroyed 5 square miles of the city. Let's move on to our next slide. Very quickly here, this is an important part of our story. Thank you, Mark, for the comment, and everybody else for the comments as well. Stalin had not been at war with the Japanese, and so the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August the 8th. Now, you know, I've badmouthed the Soviet Union already. If you're a Soviet fan, I apologize, but that's how I feel about them. Based on my comments, you might think that this was just some late cheap war land grab by Stalin. It wasn't. We had wanted the Soviet Union, the United States, wanted the Soviet Union involved in the war in the Pacific as quickly as possible. I think all the way back to 1943, we had reached out to the Soviet Union, our still relatively new ally, and said, look, can you help us in the Pacific? Why on earth would we want Stalin spreading communism in Asia? Because we wanted the war to end. And we wanted to bring all means possible to bear to bring this horrible war to the end. So we wanted Stalin in the war. We had invited him into the war. And this was formally, I think that it was at the Yalta Conference in the spring of 1945 when Stalin said, okay, I will come into the war in the Pacific 3 months after the collapse of Nazi Germany. So remember, fighting in Europe stops, I should say, on May 8th, 1945, the day after the 100-ton test. Stalin declares war on on Japan, true to his word, on August 8th. Early the next morning, the Red Army invaded Manchuria, and you can see my map there. That is from a Soviet publication, I believe. The Japanese were surrounded largely, as you can see on the map there, by the Red Army. And the Red Army was able to kill 84,000 Japanese soldiers in the short campaign that ensued. You can see the emperor's quote in this letter that he wrote to the military. You know, I look at that last bit. Increase needlessly the ravages of war, finally to the point of endangering the very foundation of the empire's existence. I would have to say that's one of the major understatements of the war. The empire was about to cease to exist. And so still, even after this invasion and the emperor's letter that was written to the army in response to it, I don't know if everyone in Japan recognized that the end was coming quickly and it would be a complete end to that regime. Just about. We will talk about that in a few minutes. Let's go on to our next slide. August 9th is not going to get any better for the Japanese. The second strike is launched that morning against Kokura. Kokura was the main target for the strike, the second strike. This time we're going to use a Fat Man type bomb, and we're going to drop two things ultimately on Nagasaki, Japan. Fat Man and something else as well. And before we leave this slide, in the center photo there, on the right, you will see Luis Alvarez again, who we mentioned earlier. Luis is going to play an important part in the final phase of the war here. So let's go on to our next slide. This second mission that was conducted against Kokura initially did not work out as well. There were, as you can see, rendezvous problems. Multiple planes flew each of these missions. There were observation planes. The bomber didn't sync up with the observation plane. They burned through a lot of fuel trying to find each other. They get to Kokura and it's clouded over. They armed Batman and flew over Kokura 3 times, trying to find a targeting point. Couldn't do it. They had enough fuel for one run over the secondary target, which was Nagasaki. And you guessed it, at Nagasaki, it was cloudy there too, but there was enough of the opening in the clouds for them to select one of the pre-selected targets on the ground. And so the target was the Mitsubishi Heavy Armaments Factory. And so the photo on the left, you can see the smokestacks from that facility. Now, Nagasaki was a military target as well. This factory complex that you see, I guess ironically, is where the torpedoes were built that were used at Pearl Harbor. You get a little bit more close-up view of the Mitsubishi plant on the right over there. And of course, in the middle, you see a woman who has been, who's unfortunately for her, received a radiation burn. But anyway, going back to the strike on Nagasaki, Batman does not explode over the city center. So even though this bomb is more powerful than Little Boy, because it explodes off on the outskirts of town where the factory is instead of the city center, which is what happened with Little Boy, fewer people are killed. And so as you can see in the bullet down there, 39,214 people died by the end of, or I should say by mid-November 1945, according to the Army Pathological Study. So again, because even though we have greater yield, fewer people die because of where the bomb is dropped. And again, we have thousands of Koreans and hundreds of Chinese who die in that attack. Now, as I mentioned before, 2 things were dropped on Nagasaki. The second thing that was dropped on Nagasaki was a letter that was penned largely by Luis Alvarez, who we've met a couple of times now. In Luis's letter, he told it was addressed to one of his Japanese physicist counterparts. He said, you know, I hate that physics, and I'm paraphrasing, I hate that physics has been harnessed for this destructive purpose. But rest assured, we've tested one of these things in New Mexico. We've dropped one on Hiroshima. We've dropped another one this morning, and this reign of ruin will increase manyfold if you don't surrender now. Now remember, Imperial Japan has a nuclear weapons program. They have very smart physicists there. It was probably quite a shock that the United States developed an atomic bomb to put into combat. But how long did it take them to make that atomic bomb? How long did it take to produce enough material for one bomb? Maybe we have a year to continue fighting. Maybe we have 5 years to continue fighting. And you might be thinking, well, why don't they've been defeated? Why don't they just give up? Well, there were many reasons why the Japanese continued to fight, even at this stage leading up to Nagasaki. First of all, Japan had never lost a war before. They didn't know how to lose a war. It was considered culturally dishonorable to surrender. As a soldier, you are trained. Do not surrender to the enemy. Can you imagine the government turning around and surrendering the whole country? They continued to fight because the more pain that you inflict on the Allies, maybe we can get better surrender terms. And Japan did want to surrender. Japan had wanted to surrender for months leading up to the end of World War II. but they wanted to dictate the terms. They said, you know, look, and they had been negotiating through the Soviet Union, who was now at war with them. They said, look, we'll quit, but let us keep the emperor. Don't occupy the Japanese home islands. Let us keep the land that we still have under our possession, and don't try us for war crimes. Well, that's far from an unconditional surrender. But they thought if we can inflict enough pain, maybe we can get 2 or 3 or even 4 of those conditions. So the Japanese continued to fight on for these reasons. And that's why it was hoped that the atomic bombs would show them, you can't resist anymore. It's time to quit now. That's the idea behind it. And so Louis's letter reinforced the fact that little boy, that Hiroshima was not just some one-off gimmick that could only be reproduced every 3 or 4 years. Nuclear weapons could be reproduced by the United States rapidly. And further resistance, again, it was completely futile. Please surrender now. The Japanese did not surrender immediately. Let's see what we've got on our next slide as we bring things to a close. This one is actually a little bit out of sequence. Michael, can we go to the next slide? That's my mistake. I got the slides out of order. The Japanese and the diplomatic correspondence is pretty easy to get a hold of. There are books that contain it. You can find documents online. But the Japanese, after, I believe it was on August 10th or 11th, basically said, we're ready to surrender. Let us keep the emperor. Do we have a deal? So the last piece of correspondence that I've been able to locate from the United States to Japan, basically, and I think this is what we see on the next slide. Actually, let's go back to that slide, Michael. I'm sorry. The part that you see in italics there is from the last telegram that we sent on August the 11th. And if you read through that, you will see that it is anything but a guarantee that the emperor would be able to keep his job. We make no commitments. In fact, as you read there, we told the Japanese that ultimately their people would vote on what type of government they wanted. So we didn't say we were going to get rid of the emperor. We didn't say that we were going to triumph for war crimes or not triumph for war crimes or anything else. We just said you'll surrender unconditionally, and then we're going to decide what's going to happen. Our military governor of Japan is going to take whatever steps he deems proper to make sure that you surrender unconditionally. And by the way, you can see our governor, military governor of Japan there on the left. That is General Douglas MacArthur, and of course, Emperor Hirohito standing next to him. So we get to the next slide. And so Imperial Japan, at least in my opinion, and I think that it's more than an opinion and that the diplomatic correspondence bears it out, Japan did surrender unconditionally, and fighting stopped on August 14th, 1945. That's more than a week after Hiroshima. And so the last 7-8 days of Imperial Japan's existence was incredibly violent and deadly for that country. But fortunately, the war ended, but not before World War II claimed between 60 and 80 million lives worldwide. You can see the emperor, and keep in mind that the emperor is basically viewed as a deity in Japan. If you were an average Japanese citizen, you didn't see the emperor or hear from him until the morning of August 14th, when a recorded speech was played from the emperor over the radio. And what you see quoted down there is about a quarter of that speech. You can find the rest of his speech online if you would like to see the complete context, which I encourage you to do. But I chose this portion of it because he specifically alludes to the nuclear weapons. And you can see his press writer, I don't know who wrote this paragraph, but they did a phenomenal job spinning a horrible situation. But I think it's pretty clear that the atomic bombs were an important ingredient in bringing World War II to an end. And I do want to touch on that just for a moment before we close. No one thing ended World War II. Some people will say, well, nuclear bombs, they didn't play any role. Some people will say, well, nuclear bombs won the war and things like that. Think of the end of World War II like you're making a cupcake. I like cupcakes. Maybe you do too. Now, a cupcake is not made out of one thing. It's made out of flour and sugar and more sugar and corn oil and maybe butter and all this other stuff. And together you mix them up and you get a cupcake. Bringing Imperial Japan to the surrender table was the product of many things. Now, in a cupcake, some ingredients are more important than others, but they all play a role. I think that the nuclear weapons played a significant role in that successful recipe that brought this horrible war to an end. So did all the conventional victories that the Allies achieved over the years. So did the blockade. So did conventional bombing. So did the Soviet entry into the war. I do think, though, that the ingredient that was provided by the nuclear weapons was bringing the war to a victorious end more quickly than it would have otherwise. And so, again, all important ingredients is how I think of it anyway. And agree or disagree, but that's in my study of history, that's what it is. And I think we're about down to our last slide or two, which are going to go really fast. These are some numbers so that you can put the atomic bombings and other things in contrast in terms of the amount of death and pain and suffering. And again, that's something that I can't quantify, and I really don't want to. I want to stay friends with all of you. But you know, when you're dealing with numbers like 64,500 or 2 million or whatever it may be, I don't often agree with Joseph Stalin, but I think his quote that you see there on the screen does pretty much capture it. But anyway, hopefully these numbers do provide some context as you think about World War II. And fortunately, we've not seen another war on this scale since, and hopefully we never will again. And I do think that atomic bombs have played a part in rendering wars of this scale obsolete. Let's hope that that holds true from here on out. Let's look at our last slide really quickly to bring it back to Los Alamos. In October of 45, Oppenheimer came back to Los Alamos. He quit as the director pretty quickly after World War II and was replaced by Norris Bradbury, who you saw at the top of the Trinity Tower earlier. He came back to receive the Army-Navy E Award for excellence in wartime production from his boss, General Groves. And so that picture that you see in the center, well, the picture that you see there, that was taken in Los Alamos, downtown Los Alamos after the war. Oppenheimer quickly came up with a speech, and you can see the entire speech down there written, and we can leave that on the screen as we, I don't know, maybe Michael will let us get in a couple of questions really quickly. And again, my bad for going overtime. But Oppenheimer basically improvised the speech that you see there on the screen. Here at Los Alamos, you know, we still have a nuclear weapons program. It's called the Stockpile Stewardship Program. We can talk more about that as well on a different day. We're always looking for great engineers, scientists to come help us out. So I hope that some of you maybe will be colleagues of mine one of these days at the laboratory. But the United States clearly bears a significant responsibility for bringing nuclear weapons into existence and being the first and only country to use them in combat. That's something that we take very seriously as we ensure that the United States continues to maintain a safe and secure nuclear deterrent. And that charge goes back to Oppenheimer's speech that you see written there. But again, I want to thank you for attending the talk. Michael, thank you for the invitation. Great group, almost the whole group stayed with us the whole time. Hopefully we'll get to do this again one of these days. But again, thank you very much for letting me be a part of your afternoon.
Well, thank you very much. I think the context is super important and the perspective is very helpful, especially for someone as young as me who doesn't have all of that. And I also appreciate the humor throughout. I was laughing on mute, so.
Okay. I like to try to keep it light despite the heavy subject matter.
Yes,
so.
Of course. So yeah, if people do have questions, feel free to throw it in the chat. I think as much time as Alan has, I'm happy to keep the line open. Maybe a couple of minutes, and then yeah, the link of this video will be up tomorrow. So yeah, thank you very much again, and it seems like everybody really enjoyed it. So we might have to ask you to come back.
I'd like to do that. And for those of you out there who might be interested in sending me a question, maybe you think of something later, or a correction. If you come across a correction or more information, I'm always looking to improve the talks and make them better for folks. My email address is abcar@lanel.gov. And so that is ABC, like the alphabet, ARR, abcar, at LANL, that's for Los Alamos National Laboratory, lanel.gov, abcar@lanel.gov. And I'd love to hear from some of you one of these days, real soon.
Great. So I'll kind of scroll through the chat. Lots of thank yous and lots of praise for the talk. Let's try to see if there are questions in here that we might have missed. Maybe while people are typing them, I have a quick question. And early on, you showed a map, the spread of the program across the whole country. And it seemed, I guess, logistically inconvenient to have spread it out like that. So I guess, was there a reason? Was that like congressional money approval? Like, how did that come to be?
I do think that congressional money is always a part of it. There's some good stories about, this was a super secret project, and it was a super expensive one. The total cost of the project was about $2 billion, which does not sound like much today. And even by today's standard, even if you do the math, it was a remarkable bargain what they were able to get for it. But yeah, of course, everybody that knew something was going on, they want a little piece of the action. They're trying to make deals. But the main reason, I think, was for security. They wanted to spread the work out. That was one reason. The other was there were some practical reasons for this as well. And I'll mention those really quickly. As far as security goes, the entire project, whether it was the facilities or it was the individual members of the team. Actually, I see Marcos there. There is another slide, but it's usually one that I just show for non-proliferation. I can show that in a few minutes if you'd like to see the last slide on there. You'll get to meet Norris, but let me show you that one in a moment. We'll finish the answer here. So, from compartmentalization, they still practice this today in the complex. It applies to me as well. Oh, I know. Well, man, they're coming in fast now. So I'm going to give up trying to read the comments for a moment. I'll leave that to Michael. But, if, let's say that you have somebody like Klaus Fuchs, who we mentioned earlier, who was a spy, you want to limit the damage only to what he knew. You don't want any one person to know everything. Unfortunately, Klaus Fuchs knew a lot about weapons design, and that was very helpful for the Soviet Union. But anyway, you want to limit the damage. Same way, if you have your entire project in one space that can be bombed or something like that, then you may be out of business very quickly. So there was the security aspect of that. But the other thing was, for instance, in order to enrich uranium, you're going to need an awful lot of electricity. The enrichment of uranium consumed a fair portion of the total electricity created in the United States at that point in time. So one of the reasons why you set it up in Tennessee is that back during the Great Depression, you've got all of these works programs for people who don't have jobs, federal works programs. And they built many dams along the rivers of Tennessee. And collectively, this system was known as the Tennessee Valley Authority. So, hey, let's try and enrich uranium right next to this source of incredible hydroelectric power. Similarly, if we're going to make plutonium, cooking plutonium in reactors, like lots of reactors, we need something to cool the reactors. And so it was built on the Columbia River in eastern Washington. I think it took something like 25,000 gallons of water per minute to cool the reactors. And so you've got this combination of security and just geography and natural resources and unnatural resources, if you will, like the Tennessee Valley Authority that helped. For Los Alamos, we just wanted to isolate it. We didn't want it, the weapons design laboratory, close to a major city where you can just walk out and interact with thousands of people. Needed it to be isolated and contained and out of the sight of the public. And so those are some of the reasons there.
Cool. I like those a lot in it, and it reminds me that things are way more connected than I always remember. Going back to the question from Sunny, it was why are atomic bomb units always in TNT?
Oh, right. I think that it's just a convenient measure, unit of measure, if you will. It's something that at the beginning of the nuclear age, that was something that people understood. That's how you measured large conventional blast, was in units, in tons of TNT. And so when you get to nuclear weapons, you're getting into huge amounts of TNT. And so I think what they did was they just kind of adopted the traditional measuring system. If somebody else has some insight into that, let me know. I'm not sure, this is my guess, but I think that they just went with the way that they had always measured things, which was in the number of tons of TNT. And then, yes, here we have a comment from Eric to that end as well. And of course, in the early days of nuclear weapons, we're measuring thousands of tons of TNT, hence kilotons. When we get into hydrogen bombs, maybe we'll talk about those one of these days when we get into the Cold War, then we move into megatons. And so now we're talking millions of tons of TNT with the advent of hydrogen bombs in the early 1950s. But anyway, I wish I had a more comprehensive answer, but that's my thought. So
cool. A question from John was maybe I missed it, but did the U.S. have any knowledge of the heavy water, or so deuterium water operations in Europe during the war? I know.
Yes, and so I'm not an expert on that, and some of you may know, I have heard, and I need to watch this, but I think that there's a documentary, is it on Amazon Prime or something like that, about the Norwegian heavy water manufacturing effort that was going on. The Germans wanted to use heavy water as a moderator for their reactor, for their program, and this was known. There were raids that were launched against these operations. I think that the documentary, and I say documentary, I think it may be a historical drama. I think it's kind of a combination of history and fiction. But anyway, I do think that the Brits initiated bombing raids to try and did disrupt heavy water production that the Germans were relying on. We didn't use heavy water. We use graphite. Graphite's easier. Graphite's cheaper, and it makes a really nice moderator for your reactor as well. And so that's the route that we chose. But a very good question, and there is a lot of information, and I do need to watch these shows and read more about it. And I do have colleagues who are scientists at the laboratory who could give you a much better answer on that. But hopefully that at least gives a basic answer to the question.
Cool, thank you. A question from Owen is, what was the global reaction like to the two bombs at the end of the war? Did other nations accelerate or de-accelerate their programs or criticize the U.S.?
Right, and so, I don't have exact numbers like polls or different things like that, but the use of the atomic bombs at the end of the war was not widely controversial at the time. There were, there were concerns, and I don't want to say, oh, everybody agreed at the end of the war and then things changed. Wouldn't exactly like that, but there was a lot more support for using the atomic bombs, especially among people in the military. And I can give you some examples of that, some specific examples. But I think that most people, at that point in time, far different place than it was, the world was 10 years later, or certainly today. People knew, they had friends, they had family members who had fought and died in the war. Millions of people were wiped out. The Japanese were viewed. I mean, again, when I mentioned earlier that Japan was one of the most murderous regimes in modern history, that's something that, to me at least, is unimaginable now, because, the United States and Japan have had a very close and productive diplomatic relationship, economic relationship since the end of World War II. Japan's a very peaceful country. When I think of Japan today, I think of Nintendo. I think of my cars outside. My daughter likes to watch anime. We don't think of Imperial Japan and what it was like in the first half of the 20th century, especially as they expanded in Godzilla, right? That'll be a part of the Cold War discussion next. But anyway, it's really unimaginable to think of what Japan was like back then. I think that if we ask the Chinese government today, and I know that the United States and China were not really getting along at this moment, hopefully that'll improve soon. But I think that if we ask the Chinese government today, how many of your people were killed by the Japanese during the multi-year occupation of Manchuria and coastal China? I've seen multiple numbers, and before I give them to you, I do think that these numbers are high. I forget if I had them on one of my previous slides, but I think that the official number, correct me if I'm wrong, of the Chinese government, 20 million people killed, 20 million Chinese killed under Japanese rule. I've also seen diplomatic documents from the recent past. The Chinese diplomats have given the number of 35 million people killed. My guess is, again, not an expert on this topic, but based on the things that I've seen, because again, mass murder is not one of those things where people generally keep really tight records of. I would guess the number's probably more 8 to 10 million people. John mentioned starvation. There were intentional and unintentional starvations that happened both in the Soviet Union. Stalin did that to his own people, but it happened in China under Japanese rule as well. So a combination of things, but anyway, I think that having recognized the nature of that regime, the nature of Nazi Germany, the violence of World War II, and that we had few options moving forward to achieve an unconditional surrender, there was not a whole lot of, you didn't see a whole lot of dissension about the decision to use the bombs in the mid 40s, if you will, the later 1940s. That gradually increased over time. I think that now, if you asked people, just average people what they know about World War II, if they even remember it or know anything about it, the decision to use the atomic bombs is a very unpopular decision. To me, as a historian, when you consider the historical context, sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where there's no simple solution. The politicians, they always make it sound like, oh, there's just an easy solution. The other guy's just missing it. Sometimes there's no easy solution. There's no good solution to a problem. And I think that that's certainly the case with the end of World War II. There was no easy way, no simple, bloodless way to end World War II. And I think given the historical context, that probably the use of the atomic bombs was probably the best horrible choice that they decided to do. And so to me, it makes a lot of sense within the context of the time. You take it without it or outside of the context of the time, it seems like an awfully barbarous thing to do.
Great, thank you. I do think we are short on time, so Alan gave everybody his email, abcar@lano.gov. I put it in the chat. And, there's so much interest in this talk. I think what we're going to do is we're going to poll everybody that was here today on what they'd like to hear more about, whether it's the Trinity or the Cold War, or I think you said espionage.
Yes.
And we're definitely going to have to ask you to come back.
Hey, great. Well, Michael, this has been a great crowd. A lot of the crowd's still here. Lots of great questions. I saw them coming up on the screen. And Jacob, thank you and everybody else for the kind and encouraging words. Hopefully we'll meet again soon. I wish you all the best. And again, with everything that's going on in the world and our country right now, stay safe, stay healthy, and let's hope for better days soon. All of you take care, okay?
You too. Thank you again. Bye-bye.